Bureaucrats don't bleed. They sit in sterile, temperature-controlled orbital chambers, light-years away, stamping quarantine codes on entire species. When the High Council declared the colony world a lost cause, citing an incurable necrotic spore, they expected silence. They expected the universe to politely nod and let 8 billion souls choke on their own melting lungs in the dark. Humanity didn't nod. We didn't send thoughts and prayers. We spun up 10,000 hyperdrives, packed our holds with broad-spectrum antivirals, and dared the galaxy to stop us. Coffee tasted like copper wire and regret. Levi stared at the bottom of his porcelain mug, watching the brown sludge swirl in time with the low, persistent vibration of the orbital station's life support turbines. The mess hall smelled of floor wax, burnt ozone, and the stale sweat of 300 exhausted medical personnel. On the far wall, a monolithic screen displayed the Galactic Council's live broadcast. Nobody was eating. The synthetic scrambled eggs on Levi's tray were growing a thick, rubbery skin. Therefore, under Article 4 of the Biological Containment Act, the Council's spokesman droned, the alien was a tall, smooth-skinned creature draped in shimmering blue silk, its voice translated into a flat, synthesized English that lacked any trace of empathy. The planet is hereby designated a Class X hazard. Total blockade. No vessels may enter. No vessels may leave. The affliction must burn itself out. It is a regrettable but mathematical necessity. The screen went black. The silence in the mess hall was heavy. It pressed against Levi's eardrums. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the rough stubble along his jawline, the grease on his forehead. He was a trauma surgeon, a man who had spent the last 10 years putting humans and non-humans back together with biofoam, staples, and sheer stubbornness. He knew what burn itself out meant. It meant coughing up pieces of your respiratory tract until your heart gave out from the sheer effort of pushing oxygenless blood through your veins. Mathematical necessity, Carter muttered from across the table. Carter was a pediatric nurse, a giant of a man with hands like dinner plates. His voice was thick. He didn't look angry. He looked hollow. 8 billion people. They're just crossing them off a ledger. Levi didn't answer. His stomach churned. He wanted to throw his coffee at the blank screen, but he was too tired. He just set the mug down. The ceramic clinked against the metal table, loud in the quiet room. The heavy blast doors of the mess hall hissed open. General Wyatt stepped through. Wyatt was a relic of the old resource wars, a man whose face was mapped with scars and deep, cynical lines. His uniform was immaculate, but the way he carried himself, shoulders slightly hunched, hands resting on his utility belt, spoke of chronic fatigue. He didn't walk to a podium. He didn't wait for someone to call the room to attention. He just stood in the center of the scuffed linoleum floor and looked at them. "You saw the broadcast," Wyatt said. His voice was gravel, barely louder than the hum of the vents, but it carried. "The Council has washed their hands of it. The blockade is in place. As of 5 minutes ago, any ship approaching the colony will be fired upon by Council dreadnoughts." A murmur rippled through the room. Levi felt a muscle twitch in his jaw. "Earth Command had a closed-door meeting," Wyatt continued, pulling a crumpled data pad from his pocket. He didn't look at it. He looked at the faces staring back at him. "The politicians debated treaties. They talked about sanctions. They talked about our fragile standing in the galactic community." Wyatt paused. He let out a breath through his nose. "Then the Surgeon General told the politicians to kindly go to hell." Levi's chest tightened. "We are not leaving them to rot," Wyatt said, his voice dropping an octave, losing the detached military cadence and adopting something raw and jagged. "We have an armada gathering at the Jupiter Relay. It's not a military fleet. We don't have the guns to fight a council blockade, but we have cargo haulers. We have retrofitted luxury liners, garbage scows, mining frigates, and science vessels. 10,000 ships. If it has a warp drive and can hold a pressurized atmosphere, we've painted a red cross on the side of it." Carter sat up straighter, the hollow look in his eyes cracked, replaced by a frantic, nervous energy. "We are loading every broad-spectrum antibiotic, every biofoam canister, every portable dialysis machine, and every bag of saline we have," Wyatt said. "We launch in 3 hours. We are going to jump directly into the blockade line. They will have to shoot down 10,000 unarmed medical ships on live galactic broadcast to stop us." The general looked directly at Levi. "I need warm bodies," Wyatt said. "I need doctors, nurses, techs, janitors who know how to hold a bandage. It's a one-way trip. Once we break the blockade, we're trapped on the surface with them until the disease is cured or we all die of it. No hazard pay, no medals, just a high probability of a slow, ugly death." Wyatt shoved the data pad back into his pocket. "Anyone who wants to stay?" Stay. Nobody will judge you. Anyone who wants to work, get to the loading bays. You have 20 minutes to pack your gear." He turned and walked out. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. The hum of the turbines seemed deafening. Then the scraping of metal chairs against linoleum shattered the quiet. Levi stood up so fast his knees popped. He didn't feel heroic. He felt nauseous. His hands were shaking slightly as he grabbed his tray and dumped it into the recycler. He wasn't doing this out of some grand, noble impulse. He was doing it because the thought of sitting in a sterile room while people drowned in their own fluids made him want to rip his own skin off. The staging area was chaos. The smell of aviation fuel, hot dust, and industrial lubricant hung heavy in the air. Ships of all shapes and sizes were clamped to the orbital docking ring. It was an ugly, mismatched fleet. Levi found himself assigned to the Mercy's Burden, an aging atmospheric freighter that had been hastily gutted. Inside the cargo hold, rows of makeshift cots were zip-tied to the deck plates. Crates of medical supplies were strapped down with frayed webbing. The air was cold, biting through Levi's standard-issue scrubs. He found his medical station, a folding table bolted to a structural bulkhead piled high with IV bags and intubation kits. A young tech named Jenkins was frantically trying to secure a rolling cart of oxygen tanks. Jenkins was sweating profusely, his face pale. "Tie it to the primary strut," Levi said, his voice harsher than he intended. Jenkins jumped, fumbling with the ratchet strap. "Yes, doctor. Sorry, it's just, I've never—" "None of us have," Levi interrupted, grabbing the strap and yanking it tight. The nylon dug into his palms. "Breathe, Jenkins. Just focus on the inventory. Don't think about the blockade. Don't think about the guns." But Levi couldn't stop thinking about them. As the proximity alarms blared and the ship disconnected from the station umbilical, a deep, resonant shudder ran through the hull. He gripped the edge of the folding table. The metal was freezing. He closed his eyes, listening to the agonizing groan of the freighter's thrusters, and waited for the terrifying silence of the jump. Slipspace travel is never comfortable, but in a retrofitted freighter meant for hauling raw iron ore, it was an exercise in physical torture. Levi spent the jump huddled against a bulkhead, his arms wrapped around his knees. The ship vibrated at a frequency that made his teeth ache. The air smelled of burnt hair and ozone, the environmental scrubbers struggling to process the sudden influx of hyperdrive exhaust. Beside him, Jenkins was quietly dry-heaving into a bio-waste bag. It wasn't just the physical discomfort, it was the crushing psychological weight of the space between stars. In slipspace, physics broke down, and the human brain struggled to comprehend the non-geometry outside the hull. But worse than the warp was the anticipation of what waited at the end of it, the Council blockade. "Dropping out of warp in 30 seconds. Captain Knox's voice crackled over the intercom. The captain sounded bored, but Levi could hear the tight, forced control beneath the flat tone. "Strap in. It's gonna be rough." Levi grabbed the harness hanging from the wall and clicked it across his chest. He reached over and checked Jenkins's restraints. "Here we go," Levi muttered, bracing his boots against the deck. The transition back into real space felt like being hit in the chest with a sledgehammer. The Mercy's Burden groaned, the metal of the hull screaming in protest. Gravity fluctuated wildly, making Levi's stomach lurch into his throat. A crate of gauze bandages tore loose from its webbing and crashed against the far wall. Then, stability returned. The violent shaking smoothed out into a steady, anxious rumble. Levi unclipped his harness and scrambled up the metal ladder to the bridge observation deck. He needed to see. He needed to know if they were about to be atomized. The bridge was dark, lit only by the green and amber glow of the tactical consoles. Captain Knox, a lean woman with graying hair cropped close to her scalp, stood center deck, her hands clasped behind her back. Out the primary viewport, the dying planet hung in the void. It was a sick, bruised color, swirling clouds of violent purple and sickly yellow, obscuring whatever continents lay beneath. And between the Earth fleet and the planet, the Council waited. They were beautiful ships, sleek silver dreadnoughts shaped like teardrops, their hulls unblemished, reflecting the weak light of the distant sun. They hovered in a perfect geometric grid, an impenetrable wall of advanced weaponry and cold, bureaucratic authority. "Tactical," Knox said, her voice dry. "Give me the spread." 10,000 human vessels in the system, Captain," the tactical officer, a young man with a heavy sweat stain blooming on his back, replied. "We're scattered over a 500-mile front. The Council fleet is powering up weapons." "Open a channel," Knox said. "Broadband, unencrypted. Make sure every news outlet back home is catching the feed." A red light blinked on the console. "This is Commander Vial of the Galactic Council Quarantine Enforcement." A smooth, synthetic voice echoed across the bridge. "Human Armada, you are in violation of a Class X containment zone. Cut your engines and prepare to be boarded and impounded, or you will be fired upon. Knox stepped closer to the viewport. She didn't look at the comms unit. She looked at the silver ships. Commander Vael, this is Captain Knox of the Earth vessel Mercy's Burden. Speaking for the human fleet, she said. Her tone wasn't defiant. It was exhausted. It was the tone of a mother who had told her child for the 10th time to put down a knife. We are carrying 10,000 ships worth of medical personnel, antibiotics, and surgical equipment. We are unarmed. We have 0 weapon systems powered. We don't even have deflector shields. Your cargo is irrelevant, Captain. Turn back. We are proceeding to the surface, Knox said, her voice dropping into a dangerous, quiet register. If you want to stop us, you are going to have to shoot us in the back. You will have to slaughter 500,000 unarmed doctors, nurses, and volunteers on live Galactic broadcast. You will have to watch our oxygen vent into space. I suggest you consult your PR department before you pull that trigger. Silence stretched over the comms. Levi realized he was holding his breath. His fingernails were digging so hard into the metal railing of the observation deck that his knuckles were white. He tasted copper. He had bitten the inside of his cheek. Outside the viewport, the massive human fleet didn't slow down. The lumbering freighters, the sleek luxury yachts painted with sloppy red crosses, the dented cargo haulers, they all just kept drifting forward, accelerating toward the planet's gravity well. They're painting us with targeting lasers, Tactical whispered. Hold course, Knox ordered. The silver dreadnoughts loomed larger. The gap was closing. 100 miles, 50 miles, 20. Levi squeezed his eyes shut. He waited for the flash of plasma, the sudden decompression, the cold vacuum. They're moving, Tactical shouted, his voice cracking. Levi opened his eyes. The silver ships were breaking formation. It was a slow, reluctant maneuver, but the dreadnoughts were drifting upward, shifting out of the orbital plane, leaving a narrow corridor open to the planet below. They blinked, Knox breathed, sagging slightly against the command console. Command, signal the fleet, begin descent sequence, and pray to whatever god you believe in, because the real nightmare is just starting. The Mercy's Burden hit the upper atmosphere. The sky outside the viewport turned from black to a violent burning orange, then to a bruised, swirling purple. The ship shook violently, rattling Levi's teeth. The heat shielding groaned. They were through the blockade. But as Levi looked down at the swirling, toxic clouds of the dying world, he felt no sense of victory, just a cold, heavy dread settling into the pit of his stomach. They had crossed the threshold. There was no going back. The landing struts hit the Duracrete landing pad with a concussive thud that threw Levi against the bulkhead. The Mercy's Burden settled, its massive engines whining as they spun down. Atmospheric pressure stable, Jenkins called out from the cargo bay console, his voice shaking. External air quality, toxic. Spore density is off the charts. We need full rebreather suits. Suit up, Levi ordered, pushing himself off the wall. His shoulder ached where he'd hit the metal. He pulled the heavy, synthetic hazard suit over his scrubs. It smelled like baby powder and old rubber. He locked the helmet into place, the seal hissing as the internal oxygen supply engaged. The sound of his own breathing was suddenly loud, rhythmic, and isolated. Open the ramp, Levi said, grabbing his medical pack. It weighed 40 pounds, packed tight with auto-syringes, trauma dressings, and antibiotics. The massive hydraulic doors of the cargo bay groaned, then began to lower. The first thing that hit them wasn't the sight, but the smell. Even through the industrial-grade filters of the rebreather, the stench was overpowering. It smelled like rotting peaches, battery acid, and the unmistakable sweet iron scent of old blood. Levi gagged, fighting the sudden urge to vomit inside his helmet. He swallowed hard, forcing the nausea down, tasting bile. The ramp hit the ground. Levi stepped out. The city was a sprawling metropolis of grey stone and twisted glass, built under an eternally twilight sky. The purple clouds hung low, casting a sickly, bruised light over everything. Ash, or perhaps it was the spore itself, drifted down like dirty snow, coating the streets, the abandoned vehicles, the silent buildings, and there were the people. They were clustered around the landing pad, hundreds of them, thousands. They were humanoid, but taller, their skin a mottled, dusty grey that was currently flaking and weeping dark fluid. They didn't rush the ship. They didn't scream or beg. They just sat or lay or leaned against each other, coughing. The sound was a wet, tearing noise, like canvas being ripped apart in a swamp. Oh God, Jenkins whispered over the comms. Stow it, Levi snapped, though his own heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Set up triage right here at the bottom of the ramp. I want 3 zones. Red for critical, yellow for stable, Black for those we can't help. Move! Levi didn't wait. He waded into the crowd. The ground was slick with expelled fluids. His boots squelched. A hand grabbed his ankle. Levi looked down. It was a local, an elderly male, judging by the sunken features and the milky film over his 4 black eyes. The alien's chest heaved, a bubbling, frothing noise coming from his throat. Levi dropped to his knees. The duracrete was cold through the knee pads of his suit. Okay, I've got you, Levi muttered, pulling a bioscanner from his belt. He pressed it against the alien's neck. The readout flared red. Severe necrotic tissue in the upper respiratory tract. Lung capacity at 15%. Levi fumbled with a heavy auto-syringe, his thick hazard gloves making him clumsy. He swore, ripping off the safety cap with his teeth, nearly biting through the rubber of his suit in his panic. He jammed the needle into the alien's shoulder, hitting the release button. The broad-spectrum antibiotic and steroid cocktail hissed into the bloodstream. The alien didn't react. He just kept staring at Levi, his grip on Levi's ankle weak but persistent. "Come on," Levi whispered, pulling an oxygen mask from his kit. He tried to fit it over the alien's face, but the anatomy was wrong. The mask wouldn't seal over the flat nose and wide mouth. Frustration flared hot in Levi's chest. "God damn it, fit," he growled, pressing his gloved hand over the edges of the mask to force a seal, turning up the oxygen flow on the portable tank. A shadow fell over him. A local official, wearing a tattered uniform that looked like it had once been ceremonial, stood there. The official wasn't crying, but clear fluid was leaking from their eyes, dripping down their grey cheeks. "You came," the official said. The translation software in Levi's helmet turned the clicking, wheezing alien language into English. "The sky ships. You came." Levi didn't look up. He was too busy holding the mask, watching the elderly alien's chest struggle to rise. He was angry. He was angry at the council for leaving these people to die. He was angry at the official for standing there instead of helping. He was angry at himself for realizing that his hands were shaking, that the scale of the suffering was too massive, too heavy. "Don't just stand there!" Levi barked, his voice raw and cracking. He shoved the oxygen tank toward the official. "Hold this! Keep the pressure steady on the mask. Press hard. Do it!" The official blinked, startled, then dropped to their knees and took the tank, their grey, weeping hands covering Levi's on the mask. Levi let go, standing up. He grabbed his medical pack. He looked out over the sea of grey bodies, the thousands of dying people spread out across the ash-covered plaza. He heard the whine of other ships landing in the distance, the muffled shouts of human doctors and nurses deploying across the dead city. It was a drop in the ocean. It was a futile, arrogant, completely irrational gesture. Levi wiped a smear of ash off his visor, took a deep breath of the stale, rubber-scented air inside his helmet, and walked toward the next patient. 72 hours. That was how long Levi had been inside the suit. The synthetic fabric felt less like protective gear and more like a second suffocating skin. His own sweat pooled at the small of his back, cold and sticky. The bridge of his nose was rubbed raw by the rebreather seal, sending sharp, localized spikes of pain into his skull every time he blinked. The triage center was a cathedral of misery. They had commandeered a massive transit hub, stringing up polysheet tarps to create makeshift clean rooms. The air scrubbers purred constantly, a low mechanical thrum that vibrated through the floorboards and into the soles of Levi's heavy boots. It wasn't enough. The smell of the disease, that sweet, rotting peach and copper stench, seeped through the micropores of the plastic. "Bed 42 is coding," a voice crackled over the local comms channel. It was Sarah, one of the anesthesiologists from the Mercy's Burden. Her voice didn't have the urgency it held 3 days ago. It sounded frayed, like a rope down to its last twisting thread. Levi didn't run. Running wasted oxygen. He power-walked down the aisle, his boots squelching slightly on the sanitizing foam coating the stone floor. He passed rows of cots. Gray-skinned locals lay under thin foil blankets, their chests heaving in unnatural, jerky rhythms. He reached bed 42. The patient was young, maybe the equivalent of an adolescent. The monitors taped to their mottled skin blared a flat, monotonous warning. "Pushed epinephrine, increased oxygen flow to 80%, Sarah said. She was leaning over the cot, her gloved hands rhythmically compressing the alien's chest. The anatomy was slightly shifted, the sternum thicker, requiring more force. Levi grabbed the portable suction unit. "Hold compressions." Sarah stepped back, her chest heaving inside her suit. Levi jammed the plastic tube down the patient's airway. The tube instantly filled with dark, viscous fluid. The lungs were liquefying. It wasn't just an infection. The spore was an active, necrotic enzyme. It ate the respiratory tissue and turned it into sludge. It's clogging, Levi grunted, squeezing the manual pump harder. His forearm muscles burned. The plastic tube buckled under the pressure, a thick clump of dead tissue blocking the intake. Heart rate is 0, Sarah said flatly. Give me a goddamn second, Levi snarled. He ripped the suction tube out, grabbed a pair of forceps from his tray, and blindly dug into the airway, trying to pull the obstruction clear. His hands were shaking from the stimulants he'd injected 6 hours ago. He was clumsy. He pinched the delicate lining of the throat. The alien didn't flinch. Levi, Sarah's hand touched his shoulder. The heavy rubber of her glove felt dead against his suit. They're gone. Levi stopped. He stared at the forceps in his hand, coated in black sludge. He dropped them onto the metal tray. They landed with a sharp clatter that cut through the low hum of the generators. Log the time, he whispered. He stepped back and looked down the aisle. Carter, the giant pediatric nurse, was pushing a hovering gurney loaded with 3 body bags. Carter's shoulders were slumped, his massive frame looking deflated. The human armada had brought 10,000 ships, millions of tons of supplies, and all the arrogance of a species that refused to lose. And they were losing. The broad-spectrum antibiotics were useless. The steroids only delayed the inevitable, forcing the failing lungs to work harder until they completely ruptured. They were bailing out a sinking battleship with a thimble. Levi walked away from the bed. He found an empty supply crate near the chemical latrines and sat down heavily. He buried his face in his hands, the hard plastic of his helmet bumping against his knees. He wanted to sleep. He wanted to strip the suit off and let the spores take him just so he could close his eyes and stop listening to the wet, tearing sounds of 1,000 people drowning in their own bodies. He hated this. He hated the council for being right. The math was absolute. The disease was perfectly engineered by nature to eradicate. A sharp hiss of compressed air made him look up. Carter had dropped down onto a crate opposite him. Through the scratched visor of Carter's helmet, Levi could see the man's eyes were bloodshot, the skin under them bruised purple from exhaustion. We lost 70 in the last hour, Doc, Carter said, his voice a low rumble over the radio. Morgue ships are full. We're stacking them in the cargo holds of the luxury liners now. The antibiotics are just feeding the spores, Levi said, staring at the floor. The cellular regeneration they trigger just gives the necrosis more healthy tissue to consume. We're speeding it up in some of them. Carter didn't say anything for a long moment. He just rubbed his massive gloved hands together. The friction made a dry, synthetic squeak. You remember the burn ward back in Chicago? Carter asked quietly. Levi closed his eyes. Yeah. We had that structural fire, apartment block. 50 kids came in at once, Carter murmured. We didn't have enough synthetic skin grafts. We didn't have enough pain meds. We just had wet gauze and prayers. Carter leaned forward, the heavy fabric of his suit crinkling. You didn't quit then. You stayed up for 4 days scraping dead tissue until your hands cramped so bad I had to tape the scalpel to your palm. This isn't Chicago, Carter. This isn't a fire. This is a cellular meat grinder. It's the same math, Levi, Carter said, just a different location. Get up. Levi hated him in that moment. He hated the unwavering, stubborn stupidity of human hope, but he gritted his teeth, pushed his hands against his knees, and stood. The joints in his legs popped. Bring me the local medical files, Levi said, his voice cold. If human medicine is killing them, we need to stop acting like human doctors. The makeshift laboratory was a retrofitted baggage claim office. The walls were lined with cracked display screens and peeling travel advertisements in a language Levi couldn't read. Now the tables were littered with centrifuges, chemical synthesizers, and hundreds of vials of dark, infected blood. Levi stood over a microscope, his helmet awkwardly pressed against the eyepiece adapter Jenkins had jury-rigged. The spores act like a localized acid, Levi muttered, adjusting the focus dial. They don't just infect, they dismantle the cellular walls. But look at this. He tapped the screen, mirroring the microscope feed. Jenkins leaned in. The young tech looked completely hollowed out. He had lost weight in the last week, his scrubs hanging loosely inside the bulky hazard suit. The human biofoam? Exactly, Levi said, his heart beating a fraction faster. The standard medical foam we use to seal hull breaches and traumatic amputations. It's an expanding polyurethane with a coagulant base. We've been using it to seal external wounds here. Levi pointed to the screen, where a small colony of the dark, jagged spores was swarming a lung tissue sample. When I introduced the raw biofoam compound to the spores, they didn't eat it. They couldn't. It's entirely synthetic. No biological proteins for the enzyme to break down. So? Jenkins asked, his voice flat. We can't fill their lungs with construction foam, Doc. They'd suffocate. Not if we alter the density, Levi argued, his mind racing, connecting dots that had been floating in a haze of sleep deprivation for days. If we thin the foam out using the local atmospheric gas mixture, make it a microaerosol, we pump it directly into the lungs. It expands, coats the alveoli, and creates a synthetic, breathable lattice, a physical barrier between the tissue and the spore. Jenkins stared at him. You want to spray paint their insides? It buys us time, real time, not hours, but maybe weeks, long enough for Earth Command to sequence a targeted phage, Levi said. He was already moving, grabbing a canister of biofoam and slamming it into a mixing centrifuge. I need 50 ccs of saline, a heavy agitator, and a bronchial intubator. Doc, this is insane. If the foam expands too fast, it will rupture their chest cavities. They are already rupturing, Levi snapped, tossing a sterile beaker to Jenkins. Mix the saline. They worked in frantic silence for 20 minutes. The smell of the raw biofoam breached the microfilters of their suits, a sharp chemical odor like industrial glue mixed with peppermint. It stung Levi's eyes. He loaded the pale blue, aerated liquid into a heavy pressure syringe. Let's find a candidate, Levi said. They moved back out into the main triage floor. The air was thick with the sounds of dying. Levi bypassed the stable patients and headed straight for the red zone, the ones actively drowning in the necrosis. He found a middle-aged local, gasping like a fish on a deck. The monitors showed blood oxygen levels dropping into the single digits. Hold him down, Levi ordered. Jenkins leaned his weight onto the alien's shoulders. Levi didn't bother with a local anesthetic. There was no time. He jammed the heavy needle directly through the rib cage, aiming for the primary pleural cavity. He felt the needle punch through the thick cartilage. Injecting aerosol, Levi said, his thumb pressing the plunger. The mechanism hissed loudly. The alien thrashed, 4 black eyes flying wide open in agony. Jenkins grunted, struggling to keep the patient pinned. Hold him, Levi yelled, watching the pressure gauge on the syringe. The blue foam emptied into the chest. Levi pulled the needle out. For 10 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. The alien continued to thrash, a horrible, wet gurgling coming from its throat. Then abruptly, the thrashing stopped. The alien's chest seized. Heart rate is plummeting, Jenkins panicked, looking at the monitor. He's coding! Levi held his breath, his hands hovering over the patient. Then, the alien took a breath. It wasn't a wet, tearing sound. It was dry. It sounded like a paper bag inflating. The alien exhaled, then inhaled again, deeper this time. The blue microfoam was holding the collapsing airways open, forming a breathable cast inside the lungs. The monitor beeped. Blood oxygen levels ticked upward. 12%, 15%, 20%. Look at his color, Jenkins whispered. The sickly, bruised gray of the alien's skin was slowly returning to a dusty, even slate. Levi felt a sudden, violent surge of adrenaline. It worked. It wasn't a cure, but it was a dam against the flood. It works, Levi breathed, a manic smile cracking across his chapped lips. Jenkins, get on the radio. Tell every medical ship to start thinning their biofoam reserves immediately. Send them the chemical ratio. Go! Jenkins turned to run toward the communications tent. He was moving too fast. A heavy metal gurney, abandoned in the aisle, sat directly in his path. The locking mechanism on the wheel was broken, a jagged piece of sheared steel jutting outward. Jenkins's thigh clipped the metal. The sound was subtle, but in the enclosed helmet, to Levi's hypersensitive ears, it was like a gunshot, a sharp, synthetic zip. Jenkins froze. He looked down at his leg. A clean, 3-inch tear sliced through the reinforced fabric of his hazard suit. No, Levi said, the adrenaline instantly turning to ice in his veins. The positive pressure of Jenkins's suit immediately began pushing air out of the tear, trying to keep the toxic atmosphere at bay. But the pressure differential wasn't strong enough. The microscopic ash-like spores swirling in the stagnant air of the triage center were instantly sucked toward the breach. Doc, Jenkins said. His voice over the comms was remarkably calm. It was the absolute, flat calm of total terror. Don't move, Levi ordered, sprinting toward him. He ripped a roll of heavy biotape from his belt. Do not breathe. Hold your breath, Jenkins. Do not draw it in. Levi hit his knees, slamming the heavy, sticky tape over the tear in the fabric. He wrapped it twice, 3 times, pulling it viciously tight against Jenkins's leg. Decon shower! Now! Levi barked, grabbing the young tech by the harness and hauling him to his feet. They stumbled toward the plastic flaps of the decontamination airlock. Levi shoved Jenkins inside, hitting the emergency purge button. The small chamber flooded with harsh, burning chemical spray. Jenkins stood in the center, his arms raised, the caustic foam washing over his suit. Levi stood outside the clear plastic, his hands pressed against the barrier. I breathed. Doc, Jenkins whispered over the radio. The static was heavy through the chemical spray. When it ripped, I gasped. Levi closed his eyes. He rested his forehead against the cold plastic. The protocol was absolute. A compromised suit in a Class X environment meant immediate, indefinite quarantine. The spray stopped. The green light blinked. Jenkins stepped out of the airlock into a secure holding pen. He reached up, unlatched his helmet, and pulled it off. His face was pale, his hair plastered to his forehead with sweat. He looked at Levi through the plastic barrier. He didn't look frantic anymore. He looked like a kid who knew he had missed the last bus home. Then Jenkins coughed. It was a small sound, just a dry tickle in the back of his throat. But to Levi, it was the loudest noise in the universe. The victory of the biofoam treatment tasted like ash on Levi's tongue. They spent the next 12 hours synthesizing the aerosol and injecting it into thousands of patients. The death rate plummeted. The triage center shifted from a morgue to a true recovery ward. The wet, tearing coughs were replaced by the dry, rasping breaths of the stabilized. But behind the plastic sheets of the quarantine pen, Jenkins's cough was growing wetter. Levi sat in the dim light of the primary staging area, holding a mug of lukewarm, powdered coffee. He was staring at the wall, but he wasn't seeing it. He was listening to the sound of Jenkins's lungs slowly dissolving on the other side of the camp. They had given him the foam treatment. It bought him time. But humans didn't have the heavy cartilage of the locals. The expanding foam was dangerously close to cracking Jenkins's ribs. The heavy blast doors of the staging area rumbled open. General Wyatt stepped through. The military commander looked worse than the doctors. His uniform was covered in gray dust, his boots caked with toxic mud. He didn't look like a man who had come to celebrate a medical breakthrough. "General," Levi muttered, not standing. Wyatt walked over to the table and keyed a portable holo projector. A flickering blue image of the planet and the surrounding orbital space sprang to life. "We have a problem," Wyatt said. His gravelly voice was tight. "Captain Knox just relayed this from orbit. Look at the Council dreadnoughts." Levi forced his eyes to focus on the blue light. The geometric grid of the silver alien ships had shifted. They were no longer maintaining a passive blockade ring. They had descended into the upper stratosphere. The tips of the teardrop-shaped vessels were glowing with a harsh, concentrated energy signature. "They're charging weapons," Levi said, his brow furrowing. "To shoot down our supply ships?" "No," Wyatt said softly. "Look at their trajectory. They aren't aiming at the orbit line. They are aiming at the surface." Levi's stomach dropped. The coffee sloshed in his mug. "Planetary bombardment?" "They've calculated the variables," Wyatt said, leaning heavily on the table. "They watched 10,000 human ships breach their quarantine. They are tracking our medical telemetry. They know we've stabilized the population, and they know we have compromised personnel." Wyatt paused, his dark eyes locking onto Levi's. "The Council doesn't view our success as a miracle. They view it as a containment failure. As long as humans are down here, exposed to the spore, there is a statistical probability that one of our ships will try to leave, breach the blockade, and spread the contagion to the rest of the galaxy. We wouldn't leave until we were clean," Levi argued, his voice rising, a sudden, desperate anger flaring. "We follow quarantine protocols. Bureaucrats don't trust human protocols, Doctor. They trust fire," Wyatt said grimly. "Commander Vael just broadcast a system-wide ultimatum. They are classifying this entire world, locals, humans, ships and all, as an active biological weapon." "How long?" Levi asked, his knuckles turning white around the mug. 3 hours, Wyatt replied. "In 3 hours, they begin atmospheric ignition. They are going to superheat the atmosphere to 3,000 degrees. They'll burn the spores, the cities, the locals, and us into sterile glass." The silence in the staging area was absolute, broken only by the distant, rhythmic thumping of the air scrubbers. Levi thought of the local official weeping tears of relief when the ships landed. He thought of the thousands of people out there currently breathing through synthetic lattice, dreaming of surviving. He thought of Jenkins, sitting in a plastic box, terrified and alone. "Knox and the fleet in orbit?" Levi asked. "Unarmed. They can try to ram the dreadnoughts, but they'd be vaporized before they cross the distance," Wyatt stated. The general pulled a crumpled pack of old-world cigarettes from his pocket. He didn't light one. He just rolled the white paper between his scarred fingers. "Command says we should pack up the uninfected and try to run the blockade. Cut our losses. We can't evacuate 8 billion people in 3 hours," Levi said, "and they'll shoot us in the back if we try." "I know." Levi stood up. He left the coffee on the table. He felt a strange, terrifying calm settle over him. The exhaustion, the fear, the doubt, it all burned away, leaving a cold, hard, cynical resolve. The Council wasn't fighting a disease anymore. They were fighting humanity's refusal to die quietly. "General," Levi said, walking toward the medical supply crates. "Earth Command told them to go to hell once. It's time we brought hell to them. We are doctors, Levi. We don't have guns." No, Levi said, pulling out a heavy, lead-lined containment box used for storing highly radioactive medical isotopes. He popped the latches. But we have a highly aggressive, necrotic biological agent that eats through organic material and environmental filters like acid, and we have 10,000 ships with warp drives. Wyatt stopped rolling the cigarette. He looked at Levi, his eyes narrowing as he processed the sheer, unhinged insanity of the surgeon's implication. You want to weaponize the spore, Wyatt whispered. I want to load concentrated samples of the active enzyme into the atmospheric probes of our fastest messenger ships, Levi said, his voice dead flat, staring into the general's eyes. I want Captain Knox to target those probes directly into the exhaust vents and life support intakes of the Council dreadnoughts. They want to burn our air. Let's see how they like breathing ours. Wyatt stared at him. For a long, terrifying moment, the hardened military veteran looked genuinely frightened of the exhausted trauma surgeon. It's an act of war against the Galactic Council, Wyatt said slowly. They fired the first shot when they declared 8 billion people mathematically irrelevant, Levi replied, slamming the lid of the containment box shut. The metallic clang echoed in the large room. Get me Knox on the radio. Tell her to prep the probes. The air in the makeshift lab felt heavy, ionized, and charged with the metallic tang of impending disaster. Levi worked with a frantic, rhythmic precision that bordered on the dissociative. His hands, usually so steady during a trauma surgery, now moved with a sharp, twitchy efficiency. He was no longer treating a patient, he was calibrating a contagion. Is the agitation chamber stable? Levi barked. Jenkins, appearing at the lab entrance, stumbled. He leaned heavily against the frame, his breathing ragged, a thin, dark fluid trailing from his lower lip. He had dragged himself out of the quarantine pen, defying every protocol in the handbook. He was dying, his chest hollowed out by the very thing he was now helping to weaponize. Stable, Jenkins wheezed, his voice bubbling with wet internal friction. The aerosol concentration is at maximum saturation. It's concentrated death, Doc. Levi didn't look up from the lead-lined box. Good. Hook the intake to the atmospheric probe's vent. And Jenkins, don't touch the seal. It's already in my blood, Levi, the young man whispered. He wiped his mouth, his gloves smeared with the viscous black rot. Might as well be useful. Levi gripped the edge of the workbench so hard his knuckles turned white. He couldn't look at Jenkins. He couldn't afford to see the human cost, not now. He was operating on a scale that dwarfed the individual, a cold, brutal calculus that the Council had invited, and now was going to suffer. Outside, the sky was a bruised, pulsating purple. The dreadnoughts hung like silver needles in the upper atmosphere, their hulls glowing with that terrifying pre-strike energy. They weren't just ships, they were the executioner's blade held over the throat of a world. General Wyatt appeared at the laboratory entrance, his boots echoing sharply on the stone. He held a high-frequency transmitter in his hand, his thumb resting near the activation trigger. Knox is in position, Wyatt said, his voice devoid of emotion. The messenger ships are docked with the probes. They're primed, Levi. The moment they break the atmosphere, they'll trigger their warp drives for a short hop jump directly into the dreadnought's proximity. It's a suicide run. The Council won't even see the ships until it's too late. Levi locked the final canister into the delivery housing. The box was sealed, labeled with a skull and crossbones symbol that felt horribly archaic. Do it, Levi said. Wyatt hesitated. He was a career soldier, a man trained to follow orders and uphold treaties. But he was also a man who had stood on the surface and watched a species die in the ash. He looked at Levi, then at the dying Jenkins, and then at the sky. He keyed the transmitter. Across the base, the ground shivered as the retrofitted messenger ships ignited their thrusters. They didn't climb gracefully. They tore through the purple clouds like screaming banshees, their hulls screaming under the atmospheric stress. On the monitors, Levi watched as the small, ugly silhouettes of the human vessels raced toward the silver giants. The dreadnoughts were firing now. Brilliant lances of white-hot plasma carved through the atmosphere, vaporizing the first 3 ships instantly. The flashes were blinding, leaving ghost images on the screen. But the ships kept coming. They were small, unshielded, and fast. They weren't fighting, they were kamikazes. Impact in 10 seconds, Wyatt said. Levi watched the telemetry. The ships were closing the distance. They were aiming for the vents, the air intake ports, the coolant exhaust manifolds. The Council's engineers had designed those ships for deep space, for absolute purity and sterility. They were not designed to encounter a hyper-aggressive, biological, necrotic enzyme. 3, 2, 1. The screens flickered. The messenger ships didn't explode. They docked. With a frantic hard-lock magnetic clamp, they collided with the dreadnought's external ports. Now, Levi whispered. The probes fired. The canisters of concentrated spores were injected into the ship's life support systems, with a hydraulic force meant for deep crust mining. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the sensors on the Council dreadnoughts went haywire. "Look at the CO2 sensors," Wyatt said, his voice incredulous. "The atmospheric processors are being overwhelmed." The dreadnoughts began to glow, not with plasma, but with a structural warning light. Inside those pristine silver ships, the necrotic spores were meeting the oxygen-rich, sterile environment of the Council's internal climate. It was a feast. The enzyme didn't just infect, it metabolized. It tore through the complex synthetic air-scrubbing membranes, turning them into a black growing mold that clogged the vents, pressurized the corridors, and began to seep into the crew quarters. "They're venting atmosphere," Wyatt shouted, pointing to the screen. The silver ships were hemorrhaging, throwing their internal air out into the vacuum to stop the spread. But the spores were airborne, microscopic, and incredibly fast. They were already in the command decks. "They're retreating," Levi said, his voice cold. The dreadnoughts were pulling back, burning hard away from the planet. They were panicked. For the first time in millennia, the Galactic Council was afraid of a biological agent they couldn't mathematically solve. The violet gloom over the capital city finally began to fracture. As the Council dreadnoughts broke their blockade and retreated into the high-orbit dark, the bruised clouds split, revealing a sliver of pale, sickly sunlight. It was a bleak, watery illumination, but it was the first honest light this world had seen in months. Levi stood on the edge of the landing pad, his boots crusted with the toxic gray-white ash that carpeted every square inch of the city. His hazard suit, once a pristine white, was now streaked with the filth of 1,000 frantic triage runs. The filters in his rebreather whistled with a jagged, strained rhythm, a mechanical wheeze that mimicked the dying lungs he had spent his life trying to patch. He turned away from the sky and walked back toward the cluster of cargo containers that served as the primary command base. His destination was the plastic-sheeted enclosure that had become the graveyard for the hopeful. Jenkins was still sitting where Levi had left him. The young tech was slumped against the wall of the plastic cell, his head hanging forward, his chest unnaturally still. The monitor attached to his bedside didn't beep anymore. The screen was a flat, lifeless plane of static. Levi reached for the zipper of the containment flap, his fingers brushing the cold, slick surface of the material. He stopped. A strange, hollow paralysis washed over him. There was no point in entering. There was no medical intervention left for a man who had traded his last breath to calibrate a biological weapon. Jenkins wasn't a patient anymore. He was a casualty of a war they hadn't asked for, but had fought with the terrifying precision of the desperate. "They're gone." The voice was thin, rasping through the external speaker of a translation unit. Levi turned to find the local official, the one who had held the oxygen mask during that first chaotic landing, standing 10 paces away. The alien's skin remained a mottled, dusty gray, and the fluid still wept from its 4 black eyes. But the creature was standing on its own. The synthetic lattice Levi had pioneered was holding. The patient was breathing. "The ships," the official continued, gesturing toward the horizon. "They are abandoning the sector. They'll be back," Levi said, his voice raw, sounding like grinding gravel. "They don't know how to lose, and they certainly don't know how to forgive. When they return, they won't come with medical blockades. They'll come with fire, total atmospheric ignition." The official tilted its head, the movement fluid and bird-like. "Perhaps, but they are not gods, human. They are just people in bigger ships. Today, they learned that they are not immune to the decay they wished upon us. They bleed, and now they know how it feels to drown." Levi didn't offer a platitude. He didn't offer hope. He simply stared at the broken city. Thousands of human ships were scattered across the plaza like discarded toys. The holds were empty. They had dumped every gallon of antibiotics, every liter of saline, and every scrap of biofoam they possessed onto this godforsaken rock. They had saved millions, yet the silent, ash-covered streets reminded him that the cost had been catastrophic. "We need more," Levi murmured, his mind already drifting back to the lab. "The aerosol isn't a cure. It's a dam. It's buying time until the spore mutates again. I need to get back to the synthesizer." General Wyatt stepped out from the shadows of the command bunker. He looked haggard, his uniform torn and blackened. He didn't look like a soldier. He looked like a man who had stared into the abyss and realized the abyss was terrified of him. "You realize what you've done, Levi?" Wyatt asked, his voice deathly quiet. "The Council will label us a terrorist species. We've weaponized a plague. They'll hunt us to the ends of the sector." Levi turned to face him. The exhaustion in his eyes was eclipsed by a terrifying, cold resolve. The doubt that had plagued him for days had evaporated, leaving behind a jagged, cynical purpose. "General, look around," Levi said, gesturing to the silent city. "The council decided we were a rounding error in a spreadsheet. They decided 8 billion lives were worth the price of a sterile, quiet sector. We didn't choose this war. We just chose not to stand by and watch the arithmetic win." Levi walked past the general, heading toward the laboratory. He had to finish the sequence. He had to synthesize the final phage before the council returned with their fire. "Jenkins is dead," Levi said over his shoulder, his pace quickening. "His data is in the drive. Get the remaining teams to the lab. If we're going to be the monsters they think we are, then let's at least be the kind that survives." He disappeared into the metallic bowels of the base, leaving Wyatt standing in the gray, ash-choked silence. Above them, the sky remained open, waiting for the return of the executioners. But for the first time, the city didn't feel like a grave. It felt like a barracks. The galaxy is often described as a place of order, a grand, clockwork design of sweeping historical arcs and the silent, indifferent majesty of the stars. It is a place where bureaucrats sit in pressurized, climate-controlled chambers and dictate the end of civilizations with a simple, ink-stamped decree. They believe in the arithmetic of existence, that one species' survival is merely a subtraction from another's stability. They forgot about the humans. They forgot that we are a species forged in the wreckage of our own history. We are a people who spent millennia tearing ourselves apart, only to discover that when the sky turns black and the air grows thin, the only thing that actually matters is the person breathing beside you. We don't deal in the math of the ledger. We deal in the frantic, illogical, and stubborn math of the pulse. The Mercy's burden was the final ship to detach from the planet's orbit. Levi stood on the bridge, his palms pressed against the cold, reinforced glass of the viewport. The world below had shrunk into a small, grey marble, floating against the infinite, uncaring velvet of space. He was shattered, an empty vessel of a man. His hair, once dark, was now webbed with streaks of premature, stress-induced silver. His hands, which had once performed delicate, life-saving surgeries, were permanently stained with the chemical reagents of their desperate, improvised warfare. The planetary stabilization had worked. It wasn't a clean victory. It was a chaotic, bloody, and terrifying gamble that had left scars on the face of the planet that would never fade. The human fleet had occupied the world not as conquerors, but as a last, desperate line of defense, pumping synthetic foam into the lungs of the dying and isolating the phage that would finally, mercifully, end the rot. They hadn't saved everyone. The death toll was staggering. The history books, if the Galactic Council survived the current upheaval to write them, would call it a tragedy. They would call it a cautionary tale of human radicalism. But as Levi watched the flickering holographic displays on the bridge, he saw something the bureaucrats would never understand. He saw video feeds from the surface, local survivors walking through their streets, no longer wearing masks, their chests rising and falling in rhythmic, healthy sighs. He saw human engineers sharing their last rations with alien families. He saw the barrier between two civilizations dissolve, not through the sanitized language of treaties or the hollow promises of diplomacy, but through the visceral, raw act of choosing to stay when the universe demanded they leave. "Course plotted," the navigator said. Her voice was uncharacteristically quiet, laced with a tremor of profound, lingering fatigue. "Jump," Levi ordered. The word was a heavy, final breath. The ship groaned. The internal atmosphere shivered as the hyperdrive spooled up, the familiar, bone-rattling vibration of slipspace taking hold. It was a sensation of being torn from reality, of existence folding in on itself. As the ship surged into the void between stars, Levi slumped into his command chair. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, tattered notebook. The pages were dog-eared, stained with sweat and the faint, permanent smell of ozone. He clicked a pen, his movements slow and deliberate, and wrote a single line across the empty page. "Math is for the observers. Humanity is for those who act." He leaned his head back against the cold headrest and closed his eyes. The exhaustion was absolute, a crushing physical weight that pulled at his eyelids. He didn't know what waited for them on the other side of this jump. A total war with the Council, an economic siege that would starve humanity into dust, the cold, lonely prospect of galactic exile. It didn't matter. For the first time in his life, Levi was not afraid of the future. The Council had shown them the dark, uncaring face of the universe, and in return, humanity had forced the universe to look back. We weren't heroes. There were no legends here, just a collection of tired doctors, pilots, and engineers who refused to let the light go out. We were people who had stared into the heart of an impossible catastrophe and decided, in our arrogance and our grief, that the arithmetic was wrong. The Mercy's burden flickered, a ghost of metal and intent, and vanished. It left the orbit of the dying world behind, hurtling toward a home that would never be the same. The silence of the void reclaimed the sector, but the ripples of their defiance were already spreading, a quiet, growing thunder in the cold dark. They wanted us to play by the rules of a cold, indifferent galaxy, but we brought our own. We brought empathy, stubbornness, and a refusal to let the light go out. The Galactic Council underestimated the lengths to which humanity would go to save one of our own, and that was their first and final mistake. This war is only just beginning, and the stakes have never been higher. If you want to follow the rest of this saga and see how humanity faces the Council's wrath, click that like button. Subscribe to the channel and share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that we never leave our own behind. See you in the next one.